Every service nowadays has applications. For example, if we want to order a pizza but do not really feel like talking to someone, we can choose our pizza and toppings over a website or mobile application. Another example, do we need to check our bank account? Don't worry. Most banks have applications where we can do this. So, what I'm trying to say is applications or apps are the future and their use will continue to grow. So we know there are a lot of apps where we can order clothes, read the news, listen to music, and watch movies and shows, order food and have it delivered. They have found their use in all spheres. But with app popularity comes the inevitable question: should we use a web application or a desktop one for our purposes? Now, today I'll talk about why web application programming is better choice than desktop ones. I'm MD Shoel Rana. I'm pursuing my PhD in computer science at the University of Southern Mississippi, and I'm going to talk about today web application programming. So before starting, first we need to know what is web or why web applications, right? Web applications are accessible anywhere, and we know that we can run it from any devices. There is no update hassle, and even we don't have to worry about the system requirements. And web applications are more cost efficient, right? So now the question is, what is the web application development and how web application programming helps in web development, right? Web application development is the creation of web application programs that reside on remote server and are delivered to the user's device over the internet. An end user can access a web application through a web browser such as Google Chrome, Safari, or Mozilla Firefox. A majority of web application can be written in JavaScript, cascading style sheet, it means CSS and HTML. And web application development will typically have a short development life cycle led by a small development team. So one team do the front-end development, which is called client-side programming, and the client-side programming typically utilize HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And HTML programming instructs a browser how to display the on-screen content of web pages, while CSS scripts display information in the correct format. And JavaScript runs JavaScript code on a web page and making some of the content interactive. And another programming is called server-side programming that powers the client-side programming and used to create the scripts that web applications use. Scripts can be written in multiple languages, for example, C Sharp, Java, Ruby, Python, etc. So now the question is, what is web application programming? Web application programming refers to the writing, markup, and coding that are involved in web application development. And it consists of web pages or services that actually allow user to accomplish some tasks. One of the example like Amazon chart, right? So we know what is the web application programming. Now the question is how web application interact. That means how client interact with server. In that case, in order to give the proper explanation, we can select one of the architecture, like one of the model or for example, we have chosen the Java EE platform, right? So in the Java EE platform, the web components provides the dynamic extension capabilities for a web server. Web components can be Java servlets, web pages implemented with Java server faces technology, or web services endpoints allow data on web to be accessed using remote procedure call mechanism or JSP pages, right? So this figure actually illustrates the interaction between a web client and a web application that uses a servlet, right? So the steps, the first step is the client sends an HTTP request to the web server. A web server then implements Java Servlet and Java Server Pages technology, converts the request into an HTTP Servlet request object. This object is delivered to the web component, which can interact with Java Bean components or a database or any other services or API to generate dynamic content. The web component can then generate an HTTP servlet response or can pass the request to another web component. A web component is then eventually generates an HTTP servlet response object. The web server converts this object to an HTTP response and returns it to the client. That means we can visualize, right, as a client, right? So now we know what is the and how web application interact with the client. Now the question is, what are the components used in web application development or web application programming, right? The first component is web server. Web server is a computer program that is responsible for accepting HTTP requests from clients and serving them HTTP response, right? And the steps like the first step is server waits for connect request. When a connection request is received, the server creates a new process to handle these connections. After that, the new process establishes the TCP connection and waits for HTTP request. And the new process invokes software that maps the requested URL to a resource on the server. If the resource is a file, creates an HTTP response that contains the file in the body of the response image. Or if the resource is a program, it runs the program and returns the output, right? And what are the web features? Web feature means it contains client, server, HTTP, URL address, etc. Right? So we already have known that what is client? Client just a web browser that are used to surf the web, and the server that are used to supply information to this browser, that is to this client. So now the question is, what is HTTP? HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It used for communication with the web server. And you know, HTTP is a stateless protocol. Stateless means that nothing is remembered. Once a response has been sent, the server forgets where it went. And you know, it contains two things. One is request, another one is response. Request means requests are sent by the client to the server, and they can either be request for a new page or involve a form with parameters. And the response, the server sends a response page in return. It might be a linked page or data retrieved from a database. And you know, the HTTP has a set of commands or methods that are understood by a web server and sent from the browser. So one of them is get, Z-E-T, used for simple request, and the parameters are sent in the URL string. And another method is like post, where parameters are sent within the packet and used when there are many parameters or when security is an issue. And another component is URL address. URL address is an identifier for the location of a document on the website. For example, www.amazon.com. So upon entering this URL into the browser, it would ask the DNS server for the IP address of www.amazon.com and connect to the IP address at port 80 and ask the server to get its default page like index.html and display the resulting page on the screen, right? Now, what are the web languages used in web application programming? First one is HTML. HTML actually used to structure and give meaning to our web content, for example, defining paragraphs, headings, data tables, embedding images, videos in the page, etc. And the cascading style sheet, that means CSS. CSS is actually used for stylish, make a stylistic info for the web pages. And JavaScript, you know, JavaScript is a powerful uh, web languages which is actually used to make an interactive and programmable web pages. And another thing is another language is extensible markup language. This is called XML. This is the meta language for organizing data. And another language is asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which is called ajax. This is used for accessing data for web application. So now the question is, what is web application? Web application is a dynamic extension of a web or application server. And there are two types we actually found in, right? One is presentation oriented, another one is service oriented. Service oriented means whenever we need to integrate an external resource to our application, right? This is called web service or web service oriented applications. And what are the web components? We already have known that what is web component. Web components contains like Java servlet, JSP pages, web service, endpoint. If we consider the application is Java based, right? Now, what is the architecture? So there are two types of architecture of web application. One is called static or classic web application model. Whenever the application model contains only HTTP and a combination of HTML and CSS. And the other model is called modern web applications, right? Modern application contains HTTP, a combination of HTML plus CSS, and JavaScript, XML, and the Ajax. That means the JavaScript and Ajax actually makes the web application more dynamic, more user interactive, right? So the basic difference between two web application is Ajax engine, right? So now the question, why modern web? The modern web comes due to the staticness. The modern web comes because, for example, assume that the documents are created before they are requested, right? That means to make it dynamic, to make it more user interactive, that's where the modern web comes with the help of JavaScript, XML, and other modern techniques, right? So in order to make the modern and in order to make the dynamic web application or a more user interactive application, we need to use or we need to perform the client-side programming, right? So to do the client-side programming, we need some scripting language. The scripting language is a lightweight programming language that allows you to implement complex features on the web pages, right? And you know, JavaScript is the scripting language is and JavaScript actually designed to add interactivity to the HTML pages, and it is usually designed to embed into the HTML pages. Now the question is, what can a JavaScript do? JavaScript can HTML put dynamic text into an HTML page. It can react to events, read and write HTML elements, validate data before it is submitted to a server. It can create cookies, modify the displayed web pages by altering the underlying document model object tree representation of the displayed HTML text. It can communicate with a web server to fetch data and modify the modify the current page using fetched data without needing to reload or refresh the pages. For example, once selecting a country in a drop-down menu, the list of states in that country is automatically populated in the linked drop-down menu. So we know how actually JavaScript and Ajax helps to make the more user interactive applications, right? So I can share some examples how JavaScript or Ajax make the application dynamic and user interactive, right? So one of the example like visualizing the data, because you know visualizing data inside web applications and presenting them to end user is a great responsibility. Companies build strategies around the charts, number, and tables. They are represented with and often use them to choose whether to pursue business opportunities. And you know, some JavaScript libraries are available now for manipulating documents based on data and allow us to bind arbitrary data to a document object model and then apply data-driven transformation to the document. For example, we can use data to create an interactive bar chart with smooth transitions and interaction. So apart from this, we can also integrate other JavaScript library to make it more user interactive and more dynamic web applications, right? Another example we can share, like, for example, the JavaScript, we know JavaScript can write dynamic HTML on the page. That means it can dynamically change the HTML content without reloading or refreshing the page, right? And what are the steps it actually follows, right? In order to do this, browser actually requests the original page and server sends back the complete page to this client. That means the browser. And after then, after getting the information or getting the page information or contents from the server, he actually displays and creates a DOM tree, right? But the question is, after a few times, for example, some users activity initiates a request to the server, right? It might be the asynchronous or to a different URL for a script. So server returns data to browser to be handled differently, right? So after getting the information from the server, the browser processes the server response and updates the current DOM in the memory without reloading the page. For example, we can see this example. The page shows that it's showing the 120 hotels in New York City, who's having the rating points like 2, 3, 3.5, or it's having the price like $54, 59, the several types of price listed here. So after sometimes user wants to filter this page. That means he wants to know the list of hotels who's having the rating points 3.5 or more than 3.5, or he also wants to get a list of hotels whose the um, average rate or average amount, that means the per night amount is, for example, less than $50, right? So in that case, JavaScript helps to reload this page again based on this requirements, right? That means clients sends the request to the server and server responds with information on content, and after then JavaScript dynamically changes this page based on this content, right? So this is the way how JavaScript dynamically changes the web page without reloading the page. So that's all. Thank you.